Fighting games are niche. They don't have the big player base and prize pools like the other esports these days. But looking back in history, there were a good amount which were pretty mainstream, especially during the time when arcades were commonplace. One particular such game was Tekken 3. Tekken 3 was developed by Namco, now known as Bandai Namco, and it went on to become the 5th best-selling PlayStation 1 game of all time, and the number 1 best-selling PlayStation 1 fighting game of all time. It wasn't just a popular fighting game, but also a prominent console game in general. I was curious and figured let's try to find out how did Tekken 3 become such a popular fighting game. First, we need some perspective of the gaming landscape during and right before Tekken 3. Games as a whole were moving into the third dimension. People were getting blown away about how crazy games looked. There were many more various types of gameplay systems and mechanics. Technological innovations were made in gaming with things like polygonal graphics with texture mapping. There was a shift with how games are stored and read from devices with the usage of CDs, which allowed up to a much larger storage space. This came with the ability to make much more complex and bigger games. One of the main selling points at the time was making games as cinematic as possible with the adoption of FMVs, or full motion videos, which displays pre-rendered cutscenes or live-action footage. In short, people thought games could never look better than this anytime soon. Now, during the 5th generation of home game consoles, the PlayStation was able to stand out with its insane hardware and top quality games. Along with them, Tekken 3 was up there by being released as a PlayStation exclusive. But even before the release of Tekken 3, the PlayStation had highly critically rated games like Gran Turismo, Final Fantasy VII, Resident Evil, and many more. This, along with the slow death of arcades, made the PlayStation the console to release games on to get the most reach. Before Tekken 3, Tekken 1 and 2 laid the foundation blocks to make it a success. At the start though, Tekken 1 wasn't even supposed to be a full game. It was just a 3D test project for animating 3D character models. This test project's results were used for creating other 3D games like Ridge Racer. After acquiring some developers from Sega, who created the first 3D fighting game Virtua Fighter, Namco got to business and made Tekken. Tekken 1, despite not looking as good as Virtua Fighter, was very well received, and became the first PlayStation game to sell over 1 million units. And following that, Tekken 2 released shortly after, with a lot more visual improvements and game modes like Team Battle, Time Attack, and Survival modes, along with Tekken 1's Versus and Test modes. As I mentioned before, Tekken 1 and 2 laid the foundation for the series with its staple gameplay and ridiculous crazy plot. At its core, Tekken is a 4-button fighting game with a unique mapping of attacks to a common control scheme. What that means is that Tekken uses 4 buttons for all of its basic attacks, and each of those buttons are mapped to one of the limbs of the character you're playing as. If you have a look at the controls diagram here, button 1 is left punch, button 2 is right punch, button 3 is left kick, and button 4 is right kick. Along with a simple control layout, the series differentiated itself from other popular fighting games such as Street Fighter, which has crazy fireballs and high jumping. Tekken moved towards being more realistic in its combat and more grounded with its movement. None of the characters have any crazy projectile moves. Most of the moves are based around realistic martial arts and general hard-hitting melee combat. When it comes to the plot, Tekken 1 and 2 are focused on the feud between Heihachi and Kazuya Mishima, father and son. When Kazuya was a young boy, Heihachi threw Kazuya off a cliff to test his son's strength. This test was to see if Kazuya is strong enough to lead the family business, the Mishima Zaibatsu. Kazuya ended up surviving the fall but awakened the devil gene within him. Yeah, there are some crazy fictional elements to this, but the gameplay is still very grounded. Anyway, Kazuya survives the fall and vows revenge against his father. That's the prologue to the series and leads to the main plot of Tekken 1, where Heihachi hosts the King of Iron Fist tournament 20 years later to test Kazuya's strength. Kazuya ends up winning the tournament and beating Heihachi in the grand finals. He fulfills his revenge by chucking Heihachi off the same cliff that he was thrown over when he was a child. And Kazuya became the owner of the Mishima Zaibatsu. Tekken 2 takes place 2 years after Tekken 1 and is basically the revenge story of Heihachi now. He somehow lives and comes back to take back the Mishima Zaibatsu and take down Kazuya, so by the end of Tekken 2, Heihachi chucks Kazuya off the cliff again. It's a simple story but captivating enough to make it very interesting, especially during a time where fighting games didn't really have any sort of coherent story. And with that, following the success of Tekken 2, Tekken 3 was released on the PlayStation 1 in 1998 worldwide. It visually looked insane and far better than Tekken 1 and 2. The animations were extremely fluid for its time and still hold up well to this day. A lot of the animations were done via motion capture, and you can tell. This is pretty crazy since all three came out on the same system. Tekken 3 was directed by a new director and was kind of a small reboot in the series in all aspects. In the story aspect, it takes place 19 years after Tekken 2. A lot of the original characters were removed, like Kazuya, and other previous characters were either made older or replaced with new characters with similar fighting styles. The main character is actually Kazuya's son, Jin Kazama. Long story short, Kazuya got into some relationship with Jin Kazama from Tekken 2, and Jin was the result of that. The gameplay became fully 3D for the first time. Despite being a 3D game, there was never a definitive way to move into the foreground and background before Tekken 3. Only via specific moves could you actually sidestep into the Z-axis. But in Tekken 3, you can just tap up or down to move into the Z-axis with any character. Moving 3D is now a common mechanic and is a huge game changer which goes completely hand in hand with the 3D visuals now. Besides just looking and playing so smooth, the game has an abundance of single player content. It has the standard versus and arcade modes, of course. Arcade mode is basically the story mode where, depending on which character you win the Iron Fist tournament with, you get a unique epilogue FMV cutscene at the end. Not only that, you can unlock new characters depending on the number of times you complete the arcade mode. You start the game with 10 characters, but including the unlockable characters, there are 23 characters in total. The other modes are Time Attack mode, which is basically a race to see how fast you can complete the arcade mode, and Survival mode, where you attempt to beat as many CPU opponents as you can on one life bar. Now these are solid modes, but nothing that other games didn't have. The new modes which are unique to Tekken 3 are Tekken Ball and Tekken Force. Tekken Ball is basically a combination of the core Tekken mechanics and volleyball. It's a two-player game mode where you basically use a large beach ball to deal damage to your opponent by striking the other player directly with the ball or by when your opponent fails to hit the ball back to your side of the court. You cannot directly hit your opponent to do damage, so you need to hit the ball to do any damage whatsoever. It's a creative way to make volleyball somewhat violent and dangerous. The last game mode is Tekken Force, which is basically a beat-em-up mode reminiscent of popular 2D beat-em-ups like the Streets of Rage series, but uses 3D character models. You choose any character from the Tekken roster and play through 4 stages, beating up the Tekken Force, which is basically the Mishima Zaibatsu's personal army. At the end of each stage, there is a boss fight against one of the characters from the main roster. It's a bit of a janky game mode considering most of the gameplay mechanics are based around playing 1v1, but it works and is a good single player mode to play if you want to enjoy beating up weak enemies. You can also unlock another character, the crazy Dr. Boskonovich, from this mode as well, so there is an incentive to replay this mode. At the end of the day, Tekken 3 did so well because of its unique gameplay and state-of-the-art graphics. It has a lot of content outside of the standard multiplayer modes, so everyone can take a break from raging to losing to that button masher friend of theirs and just chill with unique game modes like Tekken Ball and Tekken Force. Tekken 3 took a bold step by introducing many new characters and replacing old favorites. It also advanced the plot by adding in a time skip. All of this combined with its distinct head-bopping soundtrack made it the game to have on the PlayStation 1. With Tekken 8 soon to be announced, I'm hoping it can get more people into Tekken once again, just like Tekken 3 did back in the 1990s.